Hi, this is Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is the environment in Ecuador's constitution. We're going to take a look at the language, but then we're also going to talk about a very controversial decision about drilling for oil in the Yasuni. So we'll talk more about that specifically. Our objectives for this topic are first, we're going to discuss how the environment is treated in Ecuador's constitution. We're going to take a specific look at the language. We're also going to discuss recent developments in the Yasuni. That's a very pristine area of the Amazon rainforest, and it suggests that economic development is winning out over the environment. So, decisions that have been made recently suggest that the focus is on the economy, maybe not so much on the environment. Now, as we continue on this topic, I want you to keep in mind what you've learned about the country of Ecuador. We want to remember that it's not a rich country, that its number one export is oil, its number two export is bananas. So please keep in the back of your mind that fact that tells us that without oil, the economy of Ecuador is drastically different. It becomes a banana economy, and so decisions are very, very difficult. So there's no easy decisions. I want to make sure you really think about that as we go through this topic. It's easy to focus solely on the Amazon and the importance of the Amazon, and I totally support protecting the Amazon. But as an economist, I do understand some of the decisions that are being made. In this case, we want to remember that there are trade-offs. No matter what Ecuador decides to do with respect to oil in the Amazon, there's a trade-off. Again, if you protect the environment, you give up oil and all the things that come with oil revenues. But if you focus on oil revenues, you're going to be giving up the protection of this very important environment. So there's really no solution. It's a trade-off. Let's take a look at how the environment is captured in the Constitution. Ecuador's constitution speaks specifically about the environment. There is specific language there. But it's important to understand that theirs is not the first to do so. Ecuador's not unique in the sense that it addresses the environment. Many countries have constitutions that do address the environment, but they address things such as humans' right to clean air, or humans' right to live in a pollution-free environment. What I'm trying to point out is that most of the time when we see the environment addressed in the Constitution, it's about human rights. So what do people have the right to? They have the right to clean water. They have the right to live in a pollution-free environment. So other countries talk about humans' rights with respect to the environment. But Ecuador's constitution is different. Theirs is different because in 2008 they adopted language that makes it very distinct from what we see in other nations, because instead of the focus being on humans, the focus is on nature's rights. So in 2008, Ecuador made a big departure from what we see from other nations and literally talks about nature's right to exist in the Constitution. Now, they also talk about the rights of people, but both are talked about. Rights of people with respect to the environment and nature's rights. In fact, courts have used this language to uphold injunctions in Ecuador. So it gives the court something to basically hang its hat on, because nature literally is given rights in the Constitution. For example, there have been times where the court has used this language in the Constitution to stop activities that were damaging to the natural environment. So this gives the courts a lot of power to basically halt projects that might impede on nature's rights. Now, Ecuadorians refer to Pachamama, and that's also mentioned in other Latino cultures. So it's not unique to Ecuador, but Pachamama, you literally see this language in the Constitution. Pachamama is the highest divinity of the Andean people. Now remember, we've got the Andean mountain range that we're going to be going through. The Andes Mountains go straight north and south and cut Ecuador in half, and we're going to be going across the Andes Mountains. The name Pachamama is translated into English as Mother Earth. So we would refer to Pachamama as Mother Earth. They're basically a similar concept. But the word Pacha is both from Quechua and Amara languages, and it means earth, cosmos, universe, time, space, etc. So Pacha is kind of an important concept, but we're going to translate it as Mother Earth. Articles 71 through 74 in Ecuador's constitution are particularly noteworthy. So what we're going to do is look at the exact language. Now, of course, this is translated because the Ecuadorian constitution would be in Spanish. And I'm assuming, since I've found this in multiple sources, that this is a valid translation. But again, I did not translate it myself. Let's start with Article 71. Article 71 says, and this is literally word for word as it's translated, nature or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and exists, has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles, structure, functions, and its processes in evolution. All right, so let's look at that again. There's some strong language there. Nature has the right to exist, persist, maintain, regenerate vital cycles, structure, functions, and processes. That's some strong language. Clearly, nature has a lot of rights. It goes on to say, every person, people, community, or nationality will be able to demand the recognitions of rights for nature before the public organisms. So as an individual, you can demand that nature's rights are recognized. So we can speak for the trees, to use a reference from the Lorax. It goes on to say the application and interpretation of these rights will follow the related principles established in the Constitution. The state will motivate natural and juridical persons as well as collectives to protect nature. It will promote respect towards all the elements that form an ecosystem. All right, so Article 71 is very strong. Nature has the right to exist, persist, and maintain all of its processes. Article 72. Article 72 says nature has the right to restoration. It has the right to restoration. It goes on to say this integral restoration is independent of the obligation on natural and juridical persons, or the state to indemnify the people and the collectives that depend on the natural system. In the cases of severe or permanent environmental impact, including the ones caused by the exploitation on non-renewable natural resources, the state will establish the most efficient mechanism for the restoration and will adopt the adequate measures to eliminate or mitigate the harmful environmental consequences. Let's take a look at that second paragraph. Basically what we're saying here is that when there is some kind of permanent environmental impact, the state will establish a plan for restoration and it's going to adopt measures to eliminate or mitigate the harm. So the state will act on nature's behalf when for some reason nature is impacted. It will help nature to be restored. All right. Not sure we're seeing that in the case of oil. Article 73. The state will apply precaution and restriction measures in all the activities that can lead to the extinction of species, the destruction of the ecosystems, or the permanent alteration of the natural cycles. All right, let's look at that again because that's important. The state will apply precaution and restriction measures in all the activities that can lead to the extinction of species, destruction of ecosystems, or permanent alteration of the natural cycles. So the government's going to, as this says, apply restrictive measures when there are activities that can harm the environment. So once again, we'd have to ask, is that happening in the case of oil? Are there precautions being imposed? Are there restrictions being imposed that will mitigate the effects of these activities? It goes on to say the introduction of organisms and organic and inorganic material that can alter in a definitive way the national genetic patrimony is prohibited. All right, so you can't introduce any kind of species, it sounds like. All right, but the first part of Article 73 is really strong, right? Strong language there. Article 74. The persons, people, communities, and nationalities will have the right to benefit from the environment and form natural wealth that will allow well-being. So this is more about humans' rights. Persons, people, communities, nationalities will have the right to benefit from the environment. All right. Goes on to say the environmental services cannot be appropriated. Okay, some kind of weird mistranslation there. Its production, provision, use, and exploitation will be regulated by the state. So again, something in the translation's a little messed up, but basically what we're seeing here is that there will be regulation by the state. Okay. Finally, back to Article 10, talks about rights entitlement. Persons and people have the fundamental rights guaranteed in this Constitution and in the international human rights instruments. Nature is subject to those rights given by this Constitution and law. So all the rights that are specified in the Constitution go to both the people and to nature. All right, so some pretty strong language in those articles. As we said, Ecuador's approach to their constitution is indeed unique. We've already said that they're not the only one to address the environment in the Constitution, but they are the first to literally give rights to nature. But on top of just giving rights to nature, it also talked about the role of the state in protecting nature's rights. That they are going to have precautions, that it sounds like, they're going to monitor, they're going to mitigate, they're going to remedy, and the idea is that government is responsible for protecting nature. However, and there's always a however, there is language that appears to offer an out. We just saw there's really strong language protecting the environment, but my understanding is that Article 71 can be violated if it's in the common good. Now, this is per my good friends at Selva, and I'm sure that they know what they're talking about because they do litigate on behalf of the environment and the Amazon. So Selva does go to court trying to make decisions, trying to get injunctions, trying to protect the Amazon jungle. Now, I haven't found this language per se. So what I'm inferring here, what I suspect, is that the language in the Constitution doesn't reflect this specifically. I don't know if this language is written into the Constitution. I can't find it. Instead, I think what we're dealing with is an interpretation of the Constitution. And right, think about it. Constitutions get interpreted. For example, like our Supreme Court interprets the language in the United States' Constitution. So there's got to be other things that might offer some language that the Supreme Court can interpret as being reasons for violating Article 71. So if something is in the common good, then I guess you can proceed with projects that might violate nature's rights. So a key question here then becomes, what constitutes the common good? If you can violate these articles in the Constitution, you can violate nature's rights when it's in the common good, we need to know what common good means. And of course, is this idea of common good changing over time? Things evolve. Interpretations of constitutions evolve over time. We know that. The same is true in our own Constitution. So it's very possible that the idea of common good has changed over time and the courts are more willing to be lenient with respect to the interpretation of common good. Now, I want to throw out an analogy for you so you can understand that we have the same problem in the United States with respect to eminent domain use. Now, maybe you're familiar with eminent domain, maybe you're not, but we have the same kind of interpretation issue. Eminent domain refers to the right of government to seize private property for public use. And it's literally in the Constitution where government does have the right to seize private property for public use. For example, this would give government the right to seize land if they need to take it to expand a road or build a new road. Of course, in our Constitution, it's very clear that just compensation is required. Just compensation would be determined by market value. So if they take your land because they need to build a road and they think that that's for public use, and it would be, I guess, in the common good if we need to expand our road systems, you'd have to be compensated a fair market value. But the debate in the United States focuses on what public use really means. So just like Ecuador might be struggling with what do they mean by common good, we're having the same kind of debate about what is public use in terms of the eminent domain clauses. Now, in the United States, eminent domain has been historically used for what would be considered public projects that we would probably all agree are public projects. Maybe expanding a hospital, building a new road. Of course, eminent domain was used to create the Appalachian Trail as a national park. A lot of homes had to be seized and people had to be compensated. But more recently, the Supreme Court in the United States has interpreted this a little differently, has really changed this interpretation. The Supreme Court has allowed eminent domain to be used for creating economic impact. Well, what is economic impact? When, I guess, the economy benefits, when there's beneficial effects in the local economy. It could be jobs, it could be higher incomes. But when you expand this to include economic impact, you then open it up to things like allowing a privately owned mall to expand. And in fact, that was a key lawsuit that was heard by the Supreme Court, that a privately owned mall wanted to expand. They wanted to use eminent domain, and the Supreme Court supported it because it was economic impact. But is it really public use, right? This is a private mall. It also allowed a pharmaceutical company to move into a community. Again, pharmaceutical company was privately owned, right? It was going to generate money for stockholders, but it would create jobs and tax revenue. So our Supreme Court has expanded its definition of public use to include things that create economic impact, even if they're not public projects. Now, we're getting a little off topic, but I'm bringing this up because I want you to understand that constitutions evolve, that language is open to interpretation by the courts. We've seen exactly the same thing with our debate about eminent domain in the United States, and that's essentially what we're seeing in Ecuador. So the same kind of situation exists in Ecuador, where language is open to interpretation. So we're back to the question, what does common good really mean in the Ecuadorian Constitution? Does drilling for oil in the Amazon promote the common good? Well, again, it all depends on how you define common good, right? If it brings in revenue, is that common good? If it helps the country pay for schools, is that common good? If it helps build hospitals, is that common good? So common good might now mean economic impact in Ecuador, just like it's been interpreted to mean for eminent domain in the United States. But we have to ask, is this a justification to disregard the rights of nature in the Constitution, right? The language giving nature the right to exist and to be protected is very strong in the Ecuadorian Constitution. And in the United States' Constitution, it doesn't seem like we have language that even comes close to paralleling that. So, this is about the strongest language you can find in any country's constitution. Can Ecuador disregard the rights of nature in the Constitution and drill for oil? That's a key question. So again, like in the United States, the meaning of common good is open to interpretation by the court system. Possibly, there's not enough political will for Article 71 to really protect the environment. Article 71 gives rights to exist to the environment, but there has to be enough political will for politicians to agree to follow Article 71, and there may just not be enough. And again, government always seems to have an out, per my friends in Silva, if it wants to claim that drilling is in the common good. So this common good exemption really gives politicians and government a whole lot of leeway. How much leeway will they take? So that begs the question, who's left to serve as a voice for the trees? If Article 71 can be ignored anytime some decisions in the common good, then does nature really have a voice as it should in the Constitution? Some other things that you need to be aware of as we continue with this discussion. First, there's not the equivalent of the EPA to serve as a watchdog in Ecuador. In the United States, we've got the EPA, so we've got the Environmental Protection Agency, and they're essentially a watchdog. They throw their hands up when they feel like there is legislation that's too damaging for the environment. Then they go to court. They try to create injunctions. They try to get regulations overturned. So EPA is a watchdog, and they have a very important role in the United States, but they just don't have the equivalent in Ecuador. Now, they do have nonprofit environmental organizations, so they're serving that role, but it's not quite the same as having a government agency. A second thing you need to be aware of is that the president has eliminated term limits. So what that means is that politicians risk their lifetime positions to advocate for the environment. So will politicians risk these jobs to advocate for the environment? So make sure you understand what that means. Let's say President Correa wants to drill, and you're a politician who doesn't want to drill. Well, are you going to go up against Correa? Because if you keep your mouth shut, you might be able to keep your position for life. If you open your mouth, well, you might find yourself out of office relatively quickly. When there's term limits, if you're only going to have an 8-year stint as a politician, well, then maybe year 6, you're willing to open your mouth. Year 7, you're willing to open your mouth. I guess year 5, because you can't be reelected if you have 4-year terms. Do you understand what I'm saying? So politicians have an incentive to go along with the current administration because they can keep their positions for life. Whereas if there's term limits, at least when you get to your second term, if it's a 2-term limit, you're going to be willing to vote your conscience. Same thing for judges. Judges don't have lifetime appointments like they do in our country. So you can be replaced. Again, if judges don't have lifetime appointments, they're going to risk job loss if they don't align with the president. Now, if you're a judge and you have a lifetime appointment, then you're going to vote your conscience. You can't be removed. But if you're a judge without a lifetime appointment, well, then you're going to keep your mouth shut. So hopefully you understand what I'm telling you is that there's a lot of elements in terms of decision making that's just not incentive compatible. Also remember that we're talking about a government that's highly corrupt. We've already talked about the Corruption's Perceptions Index and that Ecuador rates very poorly with respect to government corruption. There's high rates of government corruption. It's considered to be a relatively corrupt government. Now, unfortunately, recent events suggest that economics is going to win out in this whole debate about the economy versus the environment. Regardless of the very strong language in the Constitution, there are some recent events that suggest that the focus is on the economy. And President Correa illustrated his potential lack of trustworthiness, and he's illustrated his potential lack of commitment to the environment. So everything points to Correa maybe not being so trustworthy and not being all that committed to the environment, or at least willing to make the trade-offs in favor of the economy at the expense of the environment. Now, the example I want to talk to you about is related to a scheme to cost share with the rest of the world for protection of the Yasuni. And we're going to talk more about this cost share scheme. But basically, Korea was planning to try to get money from the rest of the world to protect the Yasuni. It turns out, though, it didn't work out. The decision has a lot to do with economics. So I want to highlight some of the economics as we go along. So I'm going to give you a little of the backstory. Then I'm going to tell you about this cost sharing scheme. I'm going to tell you what happened with the cost sharing scheme and move on to talk about recent developments in the Yasuni. So let's move on to kind of the backstory, because this is particularly important. So if we look at the last decade or so, Ecuador found itself in a relatively bleak financial situation. And again, we're not talking about a rich country, so keep that in mind. We're talking about a relatively poor country. If you looked at economic growth, it had been sluggish and oil revenues had been falling. Remember, this is an economy tied to oil. We talked about that more than 50% of the country's exports are oil. So everything revolves around oil. Oil plays a very key role. The country's debt defaults, remember we talked about that Ecuador has defaulted twice. Once, I think it was 99 and once in 2008. So the last time was under President Correa's term, the current president. So the country's debt defaults, again, basically being a bad risk, made it hard for them to get loans for development projects. Countries like Ecuador rely on being able to take loans from other countries. But think about it. If you default on your credit card, nobody wants to give you a new credit card. So it's the same kind of situation. Ecuador had defaulted twice on their debt, meaning they just stopped paying their debt. They weren't making payments on their loans. And so it was very difficult for them to get additional loans. But China came to the table. So as a result, loans from China ballooned. China was really the only one coming to the table. And because China was coming to the table, they were willing to partner with Ecuador, and it became a very, very strong partnership. So China plays an absolutely important role in what's been going on. In 2010, Ecuador undertook an enormous investment in energy, and they started a huge project, and that was the Coca-Cola hydroelectric project. Now, the Coca-Cola hydroelectric project is really important, and we're going to see part of this as we go by the river in the Amazon as we're going over the mountains. But the Coca-Cola hydroelectric project will supply energy to a huge portion of the country, and it's going to help eliminate the energy shortages. So this was probably a good move for Ecuador. They needed to do something, and China was willing to partner with them on this project. Now, China agreed to fund almost $1.7 billion of the $2.6 billion needed for this project. So Ecuador took really, really large loans from China for this. But in return, China negotiated that they would receive up to 90% of Ecuador's oil. So basically, the oil that was being produced in Ecuador, most of it would go to China. So Petroecuador, and that's a name you need to know. Petroecuador is Ecuador State Oil Company. So Petroecuador is basically government. They would sell crude oil to PetroChina. So 90% of the oil coming from Ecuador was going to be sold from Petroecuador to PetroChina. But here's the key. The debt from China continued to expand. It wasn't just for the Coca-Cola hydroelectric project. More loans were taken, and it added up to $15 billion in loans from China. That's a lot of debt. Now, $7 billion of this was financing, and this is, I think, on top of this, for the development of an oil refinery in the port city of Manta. So I think we have to add the $15 billion and the $7 billion together. I think that would be correct. So we're talking about staggering amounts of debt taken from China. But one big problem here. When the deal was made between Ecuador and China, oil prices were really high. But after that, the price of a barrel of oil fell dramatically. Now, why does it matter that when the deal was made, oil prices were high, but then oil prices fell? What kind of impact is that going to have on this deal? Well, it's going to have a huge impact on this deal between Ecuador and China. Let me explain why. The reason it's going to have such a big impact is that it changes the nature of repayment between Ecuador and China. So Ecuador's got a lot of money to repay to China. And what this means is that Ecuador has to come up with a lot more oil to pay off its debts. Make sure you understand this. So Ecuador now has to come up with a lot more oil to pay off its debts. Again, let me make sure you're following. Remember, Ecuador is basically paying China in oil. But if oil's worth half of what it used to be worth, then Ecuador has to pay more oil. So I'm just going to throw out some numbers. Let's say before they had to pay 1 million barrels of oil. Well, if the price of oil falls in half, now they have to pay 2 million barrels in oil. Do you see the situation? All of a sudden, Ecuador needs more oil than before in order to pay off China. So remember what we talked about with the resource curse. We talked about that instability in resource prices, in this case oil prices, can have very damaging effects. Here's a great example. When you're an oil economy, you're subject to the instability in price of oil. And this is one great example where falling oil prices has kind of really bit Ecuador, because now they have to pay a lot more oil to China to pay off their loans. So where could Ecuador go? They need more oil to pay off China. Where can they go? Well, they can go to the Yasuni. So we're going to talk next about the Yasuni. Yasuni is on the northeastern quadrant of Ecuador. So take a look at the map to the right, and you see in green Yasuni. It's a national park, and it's described as the most biodiverse place on Earth. And so this is an absolutely pristine area. There's really, before oil production, no development in these areas. In fact, it was designated a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 1989. So this is a really important area. Now, the ITT block in the Yasuni is projected to hold 20 to 25% of Ecuador's oil reserves. Now, I get conflicting information about that, so this may or may not be perfectly accurate. I'm not going to worry about that too much, but go back to the map and look at that square, the white square, and it's got that arrow pointing to it. That's the ITT block. So the ITT block is in Yasuni National Park. So if you're going to drill in the ITT, you're drilling in Yasuni National Park, which is, as we've said, a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. Now, Yasuni is home to some key indigenous tribes. We've got the Guaranis, we've got the Shuars, and we've got the Amazonian Quechua indigenous tribes that live in this area. Now, these are tribes that do have some contact with the outside world, but it's important to understand that they live a very, very simple lifestyle. However, there are two other tribes that are key. This area is also home to the Tejeri and the Taromanani tribes. Now, the Tejeri and the Taromanani tribes are a little different because they voluntarily live with no contact with the outside world. So these are what they call uncontacted tribes. They have no contact with the outside world at all. And reports suggest that these uncontacted tribes have already been greatly impacted by drilling activities that have started to take place in this area. Of course, I haven't told you the full story of how Ecuador came to the decision to drill in the Yasuni, but I'm getting there, so hang on. Now here's some pictures of these tribes just to give you a sense of kind of what they look like. You've seen these kinds of tribes on National Geographic. Again, these aren't going to be the Taromananis and the Tejeris because they're uncontacted, but these are very, very simple people. They have a very simple lifestyle, and my understanding is that they don't have any kind of motors on boats. I mean, these are people that have really, very little impact on the natural environment. Now, this map right here shows the Huaorani territory in orange, just so I can give you a little bit of an idea. So the Huaorani indigenous tribes territory is in orange, and you can agree, if looking at this map, that it clearly dominates the Yasuni National Park, right? And below in tan is the intangible zone that's not allowed to be penetrated. So you've got the whole area, the ITT block that's rich in oil, you've got the intangible zone, and you've got lots of indigenous tribes that are living in this area. This is a great quote just to show you how these people have been affected by drilling. And again, I haven't told you why drilling has started, but I'm getting to that. So let's just take a look at this quote. The survival of the Taromanani has been greatly threatened by events like the last oil spill, May 31st in 2013, which according to official versions consisted of 10,000 barrels of oil that ended up in the Coca and Napo rivers, reaching Brazil and contaminating the water supply downstream that uncontacted tribes used to drink. So we're already seeing oil spills, which isn't surprising. I've seen them myself as I've traveled in the Amazon. And they're contaminating the water supply. And it's not just affecting Ecuador, right? It's going to be carried down the rivers to other countries. The next quote says, other than fixing the pipeline, no public or private institution has attempted to clean this spill. All right, so I'm offering you this for a couple reasons. First, they're not doing a great job protecting these tribes that live in this area. But second, does this sound like it's consistent with the language in Ecuador's constitution? Because Ecuador's constitution, the parts that we read, of course they were translated, suggested that nature had the right to exist, that there would be controls in place, that there would be mitigation of damages, that damages would be repaired, and we have example after example, and I'm pulling only one, but there's example after example where this just doesn't seem to be the case. Well, let's talk about Correa's move, which I'm going to call pay or we drill. which is essentially what he came up with, a strategy that says pay up or we drill. Now, this started in 2007. So in 2007, Correa told the world that Ecuador would not drill in the highly sensitive Yasuni area. But this was only if the world paid them 50% of the value of the oil in reserves. So let's look at that again. 2007, President Correa tells the world, hey, we won't drill in the highly sensitive Yasuni area of the Amazon if the world pays us. Okay, well, how much did they have to pay? $3.2 billion. So 50% of the value of the oil in the reserves added to $3.2 billion. So you collect $3.2 billion and we won't drill. Okay. Now let's think about this from both a scientific and an economic framework. On the surface, this strategy makes both good economic and environmental sense. And I'm going to go through why that is in just a second. So it seems like a very reasonable strategy for Correa. So again, pay or we drill. Let's talk about why this might be a reasonable strategy. Well, first, we need to go back to some of our terminology we've learned in earlier units. The Amazon is a public good, right? A public good. Let's remind ourselves what a public good is. We talked about national defense. We talked about lighthouses. We talked about environmental protection. Well, the environment is a public good. And what we mean by that is that Ecuador is not the only country that benefits from a healthy Amazon, right? That the whole world benefits from a healthy Amazon jungle. So the Amazon creates environmental benefits, really big environmental benefits. So we can think of this as external benefits or externalities. So there are huge positive externalities that come from the Amazon. And those extend to the world, right? So the benefits that are created, this positive externality extends to the entire world. So why should Ecuador alone be responsible for protecting the Yasuni, right? Why shouldn't the world be responsible since all countries benefit? That's a reasonable question, right? I mean, unfortunately, think about where rainforests are located. They're located in some of the poorest countries. They're located in Southeast Asia, they're located in parts of Africa, they're located in South America. So some of the poorest countries house the rainforests. Well, why should those countries alone be responsible for protecting them when the benefits accrue to the entire world? Okay, so it might be reasonable from thinking about the rainforests benefiting the world for Correa to say, hey, we should all contribute to protection. Now, also, as we've learned, public goods suffer from the free rider problem, right? So let's talk about just one benefit. The Amazon creates cleaner air. So if it's a public good, then Americans can't be prevented from breathing the cleaner air. Remember, one characteristic of public goods is that they are non-excludable. So if the Amazon helps clean the air, then people like you and I get to consume cleaner air, and it doesn't matter if we've paid or not, right? So Americans can free ride on the efforts of the countries that house the Amazon and other rainforests, right? We don't have the responsibility of protecting them. They're not in our country, and yet we benefit. We want to remember that these benefits from the rainforests are non-excludable and non-rival. So we can simultaneously benefit, they're non-rival, and no one can really prevent us from enjoying the benefits. They're non-excludable. But this free rider incentive extends to everybody across the globe. I just used Americans as an example, but free rider problems extend across the globe. And by the way, I shouldn't really say Americans because South Americans are also Americans. So when we're in Ecuador and people ask where you're not from America, you're from the United States. It's a little offensive to them when we say we're from America because they're also part of America. So heads up, I'm being maybe a little bit not politically correct here in my example. All right, you guys get the idea. We have a free rider problem. So back to my point, from an economic standpoint, from an environmental economic standpoint, Correa's strategy, pay to help protect the environment or we drill, is not an unreasonable one. He's simply saying we all benefit, so we should all help pay for protecting it. Now, fundraising efforts were aided by videos. There's lots of good ones. I'm just going to offer you this one right here, and let's see if we can watch it. And my slow internet, I apologize. Let's see if it comes up quickly or not. So there were these campaigns going on, multiple videos talking about trying to protect the Yasuni. All right, loading. My apologies. Two teenage boys at home. They're probably both surfing the net. Here we go.
The Yasuni National Park is the most biodiverse forest on Earth. It is located in Ecuador at the northwestern edge of the Amazon basin and was declared by UNESCO a World Biosphere Reserve in 1989. In it live the Taguari and the Taramanani, two of the last indigenous communities in voluntary isolation, together with over 1,300 species of mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, fish, and more than 100,000 species of insects. Only 1 hectare in Yasuni has as many as 655 tree species, more than all of the US and Canada combined. But the Yasuni is not only rich in biodiversity, its wealth also lies underground. The ITT, an oil extraction block within the park, holds 850 million barrels of crude, which represent 20% of Ecuador's reserves. Being an oil-dependent economy, Ecuador needs income from this resource for investments in health, education and energy. Financial requirements are already pressing for the extraction of oil under the Yasuni, posing a major threat to this fragile ecosystem. Habitat could suffer through soil contamination or by the opening of this area to urbanization and deforestation through the building of roads. Even if precautions are taken, history shows that degradation of the forest is inevitable. But is it really inevitable? Not necessarily. There is a way to keep oil underground. 850 million barrels of oil are worth $7 billion. When consumed, this oil would release 407 million metric tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. This amount of CO2 has now a value of $7.2 billion in the carbon market. Currently, the cap-and-trade mechanism employed in industrialized nations only considers already emitted CO2 as tradable carbon credits. The Yasuni ITT initiative proposes keeping oil untapped and trading its value as non-emitted CO2 within the voluntary carbon market, therefore generating income enough to relieve the need for extraction in the Yasuni. These funds, managed and guaranteed by an international body, would then be invested in a long-term development plan which includes changing Ecuador's energy matrix from oil to hydroelectrical, geothermal, solar and biomass, recovering and reforesting 1 million hectares of forest, and protecting 40 natural reserves and indigenous territories which represent 36% of Ecuador, a world conservation record. Through this development plan, 820 million tonnes of CO2 would be additionally mitigated during the next 20 years, adding to more than 1.2 billion tonnes when including the avoided emissions of oil kept underground. Just imagine the amount of prevented emissions and forest preservation that could be achieved if this model was applied to other biodiversity hotspots that face oil extraction. The Yasuni ITT initiative can be the cornerstone of an effective and realistic mechanism to protect fragile ecosystems and mitigate climate change. Shift the paradigm. Conservation is not a luxury. Conservation is a resource.
So there are a number of videos that sound just like that one. This one was a little bit more technical, and don't worry so much about the whole cap and trade carbon trading emissions type of story. But essentially what's going on is they're saying, hey, if we have donations, we can keep the oil underground. We don't have to drill. It offered a very compelling case for doing that. And it as a model for other countries as well. So this kind of fundraising effort was undertaken. But one thing that was interesting is that the fund for collecting the money was going to be managed by the United Nations Development Group's Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office. That's a long name. The United Nations Development Group's Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office. So that really gave it some legitimacy, right? Probably not sending a check to President Correa. You're probably not sending a check to some trust fund office managed by the government of Ecuador, right? But this is being managed by the United Nations. So this is fully legit. And you could track deposits. And for a while I did it. It was very interesting. We're not going to go visit this website because, of course, now the fund is closed. But I think if you visit that website, you can see what contributions were offered. I don't know if they're still maintaining the website or not. But of course, the fund is closed. So this was definitely legitimate in terms of a real fundraising effort. It was well managed, it was well monitored, and it was well marketed too. And as I said, I showed you one video, but there were just tons and tons of videos out there. So countries such as Italy, Spain, Luxembourg, Turkey, Chile, Colombia, Georgia, and France followed through with contributions. And so when I looked it up, those were the names of those were the countries that I saw contributions from. But I also saw some contributions from nonprofit organizations and from businesses. And on top of that, there were some entities that offered, pledges. They hadn't paid yet, but they pledged. They offered technical assistance, or they offered debt forgiveness. That's also a way to benefit Ecuador as well. So a number of countries and entities, nonprofit organizations came to the table, made pledges or made actual donations. But as of 2012, the fund only had around $10 million in it. Now, $10 million is nothing to sneeze at, but remember, how much did Correa say they had to be paid? They had to be paid, billions of dollars. Well, this was just a very small fraction of the value of the reserves in the ITT block. So this was started in 2007. 5 years, they'd collected, very, very little. $10 million, while being a lot, was just a teeny tiny portion of what was required to keep the oil underground. So overall, this project failed. This request for help from the globe didn't come to fruition. So here's a quote from President Correa. And this was actually in the Washington Post. It said, "The world has failed us. It was not charity that we sought from the international community, but co-responsibility in the face of climate change." All right. Now, based on what we've already talked about with the rainforest services being essentially positive externalities that flow to everyone in the world, this does make sense, right? So we weren't asking for charity, we were asking for, you to partner with us when we're trying to deal with climate change issues. All right, reasonable. Other information, this is NPR from President Correa. President Correa said scrapping the program was one of the hardest decisions of his presidency. The real dilemma is this, he said in a televised address last week. Do we protect 100% of the typo, I don't know what that's supposed to say, and have no resources to meet the urgent needs of our people? Or do we save 99% of it and have $18 billion to fight poverty? So I don't know what I've messed up there, but you get the idea. So he's basically saying there's a trade-off, right? Now, I don't think his numbers make sense, 99% versus 100%. This was not only going to impact 1% of the rainforest in Ecuador, so don't quite get that, but I do understand the sentiment of what he's trying to communicate, that there's a trade-off. We have a poor country, we have a lot of problems with people in poverty in Ecuador, so we can extract oil in the ITT, which is only one portion of the Amazon. We can generate billions of dollars to help fight poverty, or we could forego that. So again, this also makes sense in the face of thinking about Ecuador's needs, that it's a poor country, that without oil, it's a banana economy, it's got problems with poverty, and it needs to free up resources for all of the needs. Yet at the same time, the rest of the world, we would like the Amazon protected, right? So unfortunately, drilling plans began in 2013, and that was after the Yasuni ITT Trust Fund failed to generate the required funds. So again, remember we said they collected 10 million, but they needed, I think, what was it, $3 billion. However, this is interesting. Aerial surveys showed roads being cut into the Yasuni. And that was while Correa was asking the world for money. Now, what does that suggest? Aerial surveys, and these were published in National Geographic, are showing roads being cut into the Yasuni. Why would you need to build roads in the Yasuni? This is a pristine area. There's no development at all. Why do you need roads? You need roads if you're going to drill. So while Correa was asking the world for money, at the same time, he's having roads, oil roads essentially, built in the Yasuni. So what that told the world is that plans for drilling had already started. Even as countries were making pledges, Correa was already out there building infrastructure for oil development. So this led many people to question Correa's integrity. Correa said, if you pay, we will not drill. And he was willing to give it some time for the world to come together. But he didn't wait. He basically started on what he called Plan B. Plan B was to drill in the ITT well before 2013. So he's collecting money from countries and at the same time building these oil roads and putting in the infrastructure you need to have oil development facilities. So some people question whether Correa ever really wanted to protect the ITT block in the Yasuni, or was it, really kind of a smokescreen, make it look like Correa is the good guy. Hey, we gave you the opportunity to protect the Yasuni, but you chose not to. Some people also wondered if people had come together and generated the funds necessary to protect the ITT block of the Yasuni, would Correa have honored that? It's unclear. Now, here's just one article, but I wanted to show you that there was article after article on this in the media. This one says, why Ecuador's president is misleading the world on Yasuni ITT. Rafael Correa has moved to abolish an historic Amazon oil plan, but don't be fooled by what he claims. This is just one example. Now, I've pulled some quotes from this particular article. And so this comes from Matt Feiner, a scientist. He's at the Center for International Environmental Law. He's the co-author of a groundbreaking article that was published on oil industry best practices in the Amazon. So he's really an expert. And he says, the available evidence indicates that Ecuador indeed plans to build new access roads deep into the core of the park to reach a number of extremely isolated oil fields. In testimony before a congressional commission last month, the Minister for Non-Renewable Natural Resources said they won't build access roads. Notice the quotes, access roads, deeper in blocks 43 and 31. I'll be showing you those blocks in a moment. But both he and the head of Petro Amazonas said they will build ecological trails. Let's stop there. So they're not going to build access roads, they're going to build ecological trails. Now, the author goes on to say, now that might sound good, but in an earlier document submitted to Congress, the ministry describes the access route recently built in Block 31 as an ecological trail as well. So they've said, okay, what we've built in Block 31 is an ecological trail. However, thanks to National Geographic, we know that it's really just an access road with a greener name. All right, that's a lot of language. So basically what Matt Feiner is saying is that, look, we were told that there would be no roads built, it would be ecological trails. But National Geographic, they're the ones that published the aerial photography, shows that these aren't ecological trails, these are access roads. You can call them ecological trails, but these are full-blown access roads, and all you're doing is giving them a nicer name, ecological trail. So you can look up the National Geographic article and see this big expose that Korea is having infrastructure, roads built in the Yasunis ITT block, even though he's claiming he's not really doing that. Now, some more information. And again, this comes from Amazon Watch. That's a really good source. It says, conveniently for the government, though, Block 31 and 43 are highly militarized and entrance by the public is forbidden. So blocks 31 and block 43 are basically guarded by military, so people can't access them. That's the first point. But satellite images and investigative undercover missions into the area not only show oil activity underway, but also show the construction of illegal roads in violation of the environmental license. So, again, other sources talking about that these illegal roads are being built in the ITT blocks. It says, but don't be fooled. In fact, there are currently 8 oil blocks that overlap Yasuni National Park. 8 blocks, and I'm going to show you that on the map in a moment, which calls into question the relevance of its national park status with so much drilling either underway or planned. So basically, Amazon Watch is saying, look, it's not even just block 31 and 43. That's certainly a very serious part of it, but it's worse than that. If you look at this from aerial photography, there are 8 blocks that really overlap the Yasuni. So there's a lot of drilling that's going on in the Yasuni, and it's not just that ITT block. So Yasuni, it's a national park, but now there are a lot of drilling activities taking place. Now, this map right here, and I'm going to show you a number of maps because it's hard to kind of get your whole brain around this, but you've got blocks being leased out, and as I said, it looks like there are 8 blocks that overlap the Yasuni. So you see that the Yasuni is outlined in green, so it's kind of that backward C formation. And we're going to take another look at this map right here. Now, this is a little bit blurry, but you can get a sense of all the different parcels that are being developed and who they're being developed by. So some are being developed by Petro Amazonica. And who is Petro Amazonica? Remember, we've already talked about Petro Ecuador. Petro Ecuador is a state oil company, so it's basically government. And Petro Amazonica is a unit of Petro Ecuador. So Petro-Amazonica is basically one unit that falls under Petro-Ecuador. So Petro-Amazonica, so they're the ones that are indicated with that kind of blue and green icon. Then, if you look closer, you see Petro-Oriental is also in charge of some of these blocks. So those blocks are in the green color. Petro-Oriental was founded in Ecuador with funds from Chinese oil companies. So obviously Petro-Oriental is Chinese. And you can see that a number of these blocks overlap the Yasuni. So the Yasuni National Park's definitely not being protected, and I'm going to take the word that there's 8 of them, although I'm not sure we see all 8 on this map, but we certainly see very pronounced for whatever year this map is from. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It looks like 5 to 6 right here are present on this map. Now, a lot of attention is being paid to block 43. So look at the map on the left and you find block 43, and that is the ITT. And interestingly, look at the purple area that's striped. That's the intangible zone. So what do you see there? You've got block 31 and block 43, and do you agree they appear to overlap the intangible zone? So this intangible zone is really actually no longer intangible. And of course, there are other blocks that border the intangible zone on several sides. So what that tells us is that this intangible zone is clearly at risk as well. There's a whole lot of oil activity that's impeding on the intangible zone. So there's a lot of oil activity taking place in this very sensitive area. Now, this right here I've put together so you can get a better sense of the intangible zone. Look first at the right, and do you see that tan area that I have circled? I have the same area circled on the left. Well, now you can see different parcels that circle the intangible zone. So the intangible zone is definitely being impeded on. As we've already said, 31, that block overlaps the intangible zone. The ITT overlaps the intangible zone. And then you've got blocks 17 and 83 and 84 and 87, and they definitely go along the intangible zone. Again, this intangible zone is no longer really intangible. So let's talk about drilling then in the Yasuni. The first oil was transported out of the Yasuni in the spring of 2016. Remember, development started in 2013, but that requires, infrastructure to be built, and it took a few years for actual drilling to take place. So the first oil's transported out spring of 2016. But interestingly, and I can't quite get good details on this, some researchers suggest that the decision just doesn't make, excuse me, sneeze. Excuse me. Some researchers suggest that the decision doesn't make sense from a cost-benefit perspective. And so I found this quote: all the oil beneath the ITT fields would field the world's energy demand. Of course, this is the world's energy demands for a mere 17 days, yet would release some 410 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So again, if we were doing a cost-benefit analysis the way economists do cost-benefit analysis, we would probably decide that the costs are too high and the benefits are too low. But if you only focus on the money, the revenue side, there's revenue coming in from drilling for oil. If you don't internalize the environmental damage as a real cost, then it looks like this is a good idea, right? So we're back to this idea that there are negative externalities. The market doesn't capture negative externalities. The market cannot force firms to think about negative externalities. Now, I also want to show you this map because this map shows oil drilling blocks that overlap the Cayabeno. Look at block 12, and the block 12 goes into the Cayabeno Reserve, and this is where we're going to be. So as I've already mentioned before, I'm hoping that at our Eco Lodge that there's some kind of tower, and if we go up the tower late at night when it's pitch dark, we probably can see methane flares from some of that oil activity. So we'll see if we can do that or not. So this right there, that's the Cayabeno. That's where we're going to be, and you see that the Amazon, that area right there, is also being drilled. Now, per Amazon Watch, Ecuador averaged a spill per week between 2000 and 2010, which doesn't bode well for drilling in a national park. Now, I can't speak to the accuracy of this, but what I can speak to is that the fourth time, either third or fourth time I was in the Amazon, we were coming out of the Amazon. It's about a 4-hour drive, and I myself saw 2 oil spills within that 4-hour drive. So oil spills are very commonplace. My friends at Selva do track some of this, and they say that 1 out of 7 pipes is going to bust, that they're not using high enough quality materials. So again, how do you protect nature, which it has the right in the Constitution to be protected, when you're using shoddy materials, when you have major oil spills, and there's just not enough being done to take care of that. So clearly, Ecuador finds itself in a major dilemma. The citizens of Ecuador don't really want to drill in the Yasuni. Remember, this was supposed to go to a referendum vote. The citizens were supposed to be able to vote to decide if they would drill for oil in the Yasuni. The required number of signatures on the petitions were collected. Correa said a lot of them weren't valid, so he voided the petitions and he canceled the referendum vote. But everything I've read suggested that the vote would have failed. Citizens would have voted not to drill. But at the same time, citizens of Ecuador want schools and they want health care. And we're talking about a country that has a very big problem with poverty. So there are some seriously impoverished areas that are desperate for resources, and that takes money. We want to remember that oil separates Ecuador from being what it is now and being a banana economy. So it's an interesting dilemma, and I'm not at all trying to suggest that Ecuador should drill. I simply want us to look at the decision through both the lens of science and the lens of economics. But it does appear that economics will win out over the environment, and that's really unfortunate, and it's regardless of what the Constitution says. Remember, as my friends from Selva suggested, like in our own country, language in the Constitution is open to interpretation. And if Ecuador thinks that drilling in the Yasuni is in the common good, then it is justified in terms of violating the specific language that we've already looked at. So hopefully we can learn more about what's going on in the Yasuni. Thanks so much for listening. If you have any questions at all, let me know, and have a fantastic day.